Tampa sits on the western coast of Florida, a city defined by the interplay of water, heat, and affluence. It is a place where the humidity clings to the air even in the late spring, and where the geography dictates the lifestyle. For the wealthy residents of South Tampa, the center of gravity is Bayshore Boulevard. This 4.5-mile stretch of pavement runs along Hillsborough Bay, curving gently around the water's edge. It claims the title of the longest continuous sidewalk in the world, a balustrade-lined promenade that draws joggers, cyclists, and parents pushing strollers from dawn until dusk. To the east lies the open water, glittering under the relentless Florida sun. To the west, historic mansions and high-rise condominiums stand as monuments to the city's old money and new ambition. It is a scenic backdrop for the idyllic life many move to Florida to find, but the road itself presents a duality. While the sidewalk is a haven for pedestrians, the asphalt lanes running alongside it are wide, flat, and deceptively open. For decades, residents have complained that the boulevard, designed as a scenic connector, often functions more like a drag strip for those with horsepower to burn and little regard for speed limits. In May 2018, 18-year-old Cameron Herron was a young man who seemed to have the world at his feet. Born into a life of comfort and opportunity, Herron was the product of a supportive, upper-middle-class environment. His parents, Chris and Cheryl Herron, were established professionals in the area, offering their two sons the benefits of a private education and the stability of a close-knit home. Cameron had recently graduated from Tampa Catholic High School, a milestone that marks the transition from adolescence to adulthood. He was known among his peers as a well-liked student, someone who did not fit the typical profile of a troublemaker. He had plans for college and a future that looked as bright and unobstructed as the bay on a clear day. However, like many young men of his age and social standing, Herron possessed a fascination with speed, a dangerous curiosity fueled by the machinery he was given access to. 2 days prior to the events that would shatter two families, Cameron received a graduation gift that would become the instrument of the tragedy. It was a 2018 Ford Mustang GT, a vehicle engineered for performance. With a V8 engine and a design that practically begged to be pushed to its limits, the car was a status symbol and a toy of immense power. The Mustang was not merely a mode of transport, it was a statement. For an 18-year-old, the possession of such a vehicle reinforced a sense of invincibility common to late adolescence. The neurological break between impulse and consequence is often fragile in teenage boys, and when encased in 2 tons of steel, capable of accelerating from 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds, that fragility becomes a public hazard. Herron was not the only one with access to such machinery. The culture surrounding him, particularly among the youth of affluent Tampa neighborhoods, normalized the display of automotive power. It was not uncommon for high school parking lots in the area to resemble showrooms for luxury and sports cars. The temptation to test the capabilities of these machines was a constant undercurrent in their social interactions. Driving fast was not seen as a crime, but as a pastime, a way to alleviate boredom and assert dominance. Herron's driving history, though short given his age, had already shown warning signs. There were indications of a heavy foot, of a driver who viewed speed limits as suggestions rather than mandates. The acquisition of the Mustang GT did not create this tendency, but it amplified it exponentially. While Cameron Herron was acquainting himself with the raw power of his new Mustang in the humid heat of Tampa, nearly 1,000 miles away, a different life was unfolding in the quiet landscapes of Ohio. Jessica Reisinger Raubanault was 24 years old, a woman characterized by her devotion to family and a gentle, nurturing spirit. Jessica had grown up in the Jeromesville area of Ohio, a place where the pace of life was dictated by seasons and community rather than the rush of city traffic. She was an intelligent and driven individual, having studied food science at Kent State University, but her primary focus in 2018 was her role as a mother and wife. Jessica was married to David Raubanault, a grandnephew of the owner of a well-known local airfield in Ohio. Their union was one built on shared values and deep affection. The center of their universe was their daughter, Lilia. At 21 months old, Lilia was a toddler just beginning to engage with the world around her. She had bright eyes and the innocent curiosity that defines that fleeting age between infancy and childhood. Jessica's life revolved around Lilia's milestones, her safety, and her happiness. Photographs from this time show a mother completely absorbed in the joy of her child, a young woman who had found her purpose in the domestic sphere and was thriving in it. In late May, Jessica and Lilia traveled to Florida to visit Jessica's uncle, John Reisinger. It was meant to be a relaxing trip, a vacation to enjoy the warm weather and reconnect with extended family. For Jessica, Florida offered a break from the routine in Ohio, a chance to walk in the sunshine and introduce Lilia to new sights. The visit was filled with the mundane but precious activities of a family holiday: meals shared together, quiet afternoons, and plans for outings. They were staying in a residential area not far from the water, placing them in the orbit of South Tampa's daily rhythms. The geography of the city, with its blend of urban density and resort-like atmosphere, was a distinct change from rural Ohio, but Jessica was comfortable and happy to be spending time with her uncle. The morning of the 23rd of May, 2018, broke with the typical brilliance of a Florida spring day. The sky was a piercing blue, and the temperature was climbing steadily, promising a scorching afternoon. It was a Wednesday, a workday for most, which meant the rhythms of the city were dictated by the morning commute and the school run. However, for those on vacation, or those who had just finished school, the day held a different cadence. For Cameron Herron, the day began with the leisure of a recent graduate. There was no school bell to answer, no exams to study for. The day was his to structure. He planned to go to the gym, a routine part of his lifestyle. He would be driving the Mustang. Accompanying him in the passenger seat was his brother Tristan. Following them in a separate vehicle was 17-year-old John Barrineau, a friend and fellow enthusiast of fast cars. Barrineau was driving a Nissan Altima, a car less powerful than the Mustang, but still capable of dangerous speeds when pushed. The group set out from the Herron residence, moving through the streets of Tampa with no particular urgency, yet the potential for competition lay dormant in the dynamic between the two drivers. Simultaneously, Jessica Reisinger-Raubenold was preparing for a morning outing. The weather was too beautiful to stay indoors. She decided to take Lilia for a walk along Bayshore Boulevard. It was a logical choice. The boulevard was famous for its views and its width, allowing plenty of space for a stroller. It was a popular spot for mothers, and the visual of the water provided a serene environment for a child. Jessica packed the necessary items for a toddler's sippy cups, snacks, sunscreen, and secured Lilia into her stroller. The simple act of buckling her daughter in was a routine of safety that every parent performs instinctively. Jessica was a vigilant mother, the kind who double-checked straps and watched for hazards. As Jessica pushed the stroller toward the boulevard, she entered a landscape that was visually stunning but structurally unforgiving. Bayshore Boulevard is divided by a median, with 2 lanes of traffic heading north and 2 heading south. The speed limit is posted clearly at 40 miles per hour, a recognition of the mixed-use nature of the area. Residential driveways spill directly onto the road, and crosswalks punctuate the long stretches of asphalt. However, the physical design of the road tells a different story to a driver. The lanes are wide and smooth, the curves are gentle, and the sightlines extend for miles. To a pedestrian, it is a promenade. To a street racer, it is a track. The distance between the Herron home and the section of Bayshore where Jessica was walking was short, a matter of minutes in a vehicle. As the morning progressed close to noon, the traffic on Bayshore was moderate. It was not the gridlock of rush hour, but neither was it empty. There were other cars, other lives moving in both directions. Jessica reached the intersection at West Knights Avenue. She needed to cross the southbound lanes to reach the balustrade and the continuous sidewalk on the water's side. There was no traffic signal at this specific crossing, only the designated pedestrian signs that rely on the caution and compliance of drivers. Standing on the corner, Jessica would have looked down the road scanning for oncoming vehicles. The view would have been filled with the lush greenery of the medians and the shimmering heat rising from the tarmac. It was a moment of ordinary decision-making. She waited for a gap in the traffic, a safe window to push the stroller across the 2 lanes of southbound asphalt to the safety of the median, and then across the northbound lanes to the water. Miles away, the engines of the Ford Mustang and the Nissan Altima were warming up. The psychological stage was set. You had two young men, Heron and Barano, communicating not just with words but with the aggressive posturing of their vehicles. They were turning onto Bayshore Boulevard, the stretch of road that beckoned with its straightaways. The constraints of the city streets behind them were fading, replaced by the open expanse of the Bayfront Drive. Inside the Mustang, the cabin was likely filled with music and the easy banter of brothers, insulated from the outside world by soundproofing and privilege. The speedometer sat at 0 at the lights, but the potential energy was immense. In Ohio, David Raubinault was going about his day, unaware that the geography of Tampa was conspiring against his family. The variables were moving into place. The specific timing of a traffic light, the decision to go to the gym at that specific hour, the choice of a walking route, the weather that encouraged a morning stroll. Two distinct worlds, one of high-octane indulgence and local status, the other of quiet family devotion and visiting guests, were on a collision course. The profiles of privilege and promise were about to intersect on a stretch of road that had long been known for its beauty, but was about to become infamous for its danger. The stage was set on the hot asphalt of Bayshore Boulevard, where the roar of an engine was beginning to rise above the sound of the waves. The morning of the 23rd of May 2018 broke over Tampa Bay with the heavy, humid clarity typical of late spring in Florida. It was a Wednesday, a day that began with the mundane rhythms of suburban life. For 18-year-old Cameron Heron, the day was defined by the transition from high school adolescence to the broader horizons of adulthood. He had graduated from Tampa Catholic High School just 2 days prior, a milestone marked by ceremony and the bestowal of a significant gift, a 2018 Ford Mustang GT. The vehicle was more than a mode of transport. It was a statement of status and a marvel of modern automotive engineering, sitting in the driveway like a coiled spring. The build-up to the tragedy was not a sudden impulse, but a gradual accumulation of mechanical capability and youthful psychology. Cameron and his older brother, 20-year-old Tristan Heron, planned a morning routine that centered on fitness. They left their parents' home to head to the Powerhouse Gym on Southwest Shore Boulevard. The drive to the gym was uneventful, a short transit through the awakening city, but the vehicle they occupied was already shaping the narrative of the day. The 2018 Ford Mustang GT is a machine designed for performance. Under its sculpted hood lay a 5.0-liter Coyote V8 engine, a power plant capable of generating 460 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque. In the hands of a professional on a closed circuit, these specifications translate to precision and speed. In the hands of a teenager on public roads, they represent a surplus of power that requires disciplined restraint to manage. The car featured a 10-speed automatic transmission, capable of shifting faster than a human operator, keeping the engine in its optimal power band. The cabin was a cockpit of digital displays and leather, designed to insulate the driver from the harshness of the road while amplifying the visceral thrill of acceleration. Upon arriving at the gym, the Heron brothers went through their workout. It was a standard session, the clanking of weights and the humidity of the gym masking the ticking clock of fate outside. It was here, in the parking lot or the lobby, that the social dynamic of the morning shifted. They encountered John Barano, a 17-year-old fellow student and friend. Barano was driving a gold Nissan Altima. The meeting was casual, the kind of serendipitous run-in common among high school friends in the same social circles. However, when the workout concluded and the trio prepared to leave, the decision was made to drive in a loose convoy. The destination was the Heron residence. The route would take them towards Bayshore Boulevard. The disparity between the two vehicles was stark. Barano's Nissan Altima was a competent sedan designed for reliability and commuting. It likely housed a 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine, or perhaps the 3.5-liter V6, utilizing a continuously variable transmission, CVT. Its suspension was tuned for comfort, absorbing bumps rather than communicating the texture of the asphalt. It was not a performance car. Conversely, Heron's Mustang was bred for aggression. Its suspension was stiff, its tires were wide and sticky, compounds meant to grip the road under high lateral G-forces, and its exhaust note was a deep, guttural roar that announced its presence blocks away. This mechanical mismatch is crucial to understanding the psychology of the ensuing drive. When two young male drivers operate in tandem, a competitive feedback loop often initiates. For the driver of the lesser vehicle, there is a pressure to push the car beyond its comfortable limits to maintain proximity. For the driver of the superior vehicle, there is the temptation to demonstrate dominance, to feather the throttle and unleash bursts of speed that leave the other car struggling to catch up. It is a dynamic well documented in traffic psychology, the convoy effect, where individual judgment is suppressed by the collective behavior of the group. Leaving the gym area, the two vehicles navigated the surface streets of South Tampa. The traffic was moderate, the mid-morning lull between the rush-hour commute and the lunch rush. As they turned onto Gandy Boulevard and made their way toward the entrance of Bayshore, the driving style began to shift. Witnesses and data reconstruction would later suggest that the casual transit was evolving into something more spirited. The boys were separated physically, each in his own metal shell, but connected by the sightlines of rearview mirrors and windshields. Tristan Heron sat in the passenger seat of the Mustang. His presence added another layer to the psychological environment inside the cockpit. Passengers can serve as a moderating influence, a co-pilot, urging caution, or they can be passive observers, implicitly validating the driver's choices. In some cases, the presence of an audience encourages showing off. The interior of the Mustang was likely filled with music, the climate control battling the Florida heat, creating a sensory bubble that detached the occupants from the reality of the exterior world. Inside this bubble, 60 miles per hour feels like standing still, 80 miles per hour feels manageable. The noise insulation and smooth suspension of modern vehicles mask the sensation of speed, stripping away the evolutionary warning signs that danger is imminent. The convoy turned onto Bayshore Boulevard. This stretch of road is iconic in Tampa. It runs along the water, offering a scenic view of Hillsborough Bay. To the east lies the water, and the famous continuous sidewalk claimed to be the longest in the world. To the west, stately historic homes sit back from the road. The road itself consists of 2 northbound lanes and 2 southbound lanes, separated by a grassy median. It is wide, relatively straight, and paved with smooth asphalt. To a traffic engineer, it is a collector road designed to move vehicles efficiently. To a young driver with 460 horsepower under his right foot, it resembles a drag strip. The psychology of the street racer or even the casual speeder is often rooted in a cognitive distortion known as the optimism bias. This is the belief that negative events are less likely to happen to oneself than to others. Teenagers, whose prefrontal cortices responsible for impulse control and risk assessment are not fully developed, are particularly susceptible to this. As the Mustang and the Altima aligned on the northbound lanes of Bayshore, the vast open stretch of pavement invited them to open up the throttle. The visual cues of the road, the palm trees, the water, the distant skyline became a blur in the periphery. As they moved north, the driving became aggressive. They began changing lanes to navigate around slower traffic, treating other motorists not as fellow citizens, but as obstacles on a course. The Mustang, with its superior torque, could leap into gaps in traffic with ease. The Altima, straining to keep pace, would have to rev high, its CVT holding the engine at peak RPMs to extract maximum acceleration. This auditory feedback, the roar of the Mustang and the whine of the Altima, created a soundscape of competition. The vehicles approached a set of traffic lights. The specific mechanics of a traffic stop in this context act as a reset button and a launching pad. When the lights turned red, the cars came to a halt. In a normal commute, a red light is a pause, a moment to check a phone or change the radio station. In the context of an escalating street race, a red light is a starting gun. The speedometer drops to 0, but the anticipation spikes. The engine's idle, but the potential energy is immense. It was at these intersections that the tacit agreement was solidified. There was no need for hand signals or shouted challenges. The behavior of the cars spoke for the drivers. The positioning of the vehicles, side by side or in close formation, signaled the intent. When the light cycled to green, the reaction was immediate. The Mustang's rear tires, wide patches of rubber, dug into the pavement. The traction control system likely flickered as the computer modulated power to prevent wheel spin, launching the heavy coupe forward. The sensation of G-force pressing the occupants into their seats provides a dopamine hit, a physical rush that rewards the behavior. Between the lights, the speeds climbed. They were no longer driving, they were piloting. The digital speedometer in the Mustang climbed rapidly, 30, 40, 50, passing the posted speed limit of 40 miles per hour in seconds. 60, 70, 80. The suspension stiffened. The steering became heavier and more precise. The world outside the windows began to streak, the details of the bay and the houses washing out into bands of color. In the Altima, Barano was pushing the sedan to its absolute limit. The car was not designed for triple-digit speeds. At high velocity, a standard sedan becomes floaty. The aerodynamics generate lift rather than downforce, making the steering feel light and disconnected. The brakes, smaller and less capable than the Mustang's massive rotors, would be slower to react to a sudden emergency. Yet, the desire to remain in the game, to not lose face, kept the accelerator pinned. The convoy passed slower traffic, weaving through the available lanes. The noise of their passage was a thunderclap in the quiet residential corridor. Pedestrians on the sidewalk, usually lulled by the rhythmic lapping of the bay water, would have turned their heads at the sudden escalation of engine noise. The sound of a V8 at wide-open throttle is unmistakable. It carries a frequency that penetrates buildings and startles wildlife. As they approached the intersection of Bayshore Boulevard and West Knights Avenue, the psychological state of Cameron Herron was likely one of tunnel vision. At high speeds, the human field of view narrows. The brain cannot process peripheral information fast enough, so it focuses entirely on the point of convergence ahead. The peripheral dangers, cars pulling out, pedestrians crossing, changes in road surface, are filtered out. The driver feels in control because the immediate inputs, the steering wheel and the pedals, are responding. But the physics of the vehicle are entering a zone of no return. The kinetic energy of a vehicle increases with the square of its velocity. A car moving at 100 miles per hour has 4 times the energy of a car moving at 50 miles per hour. This exponential increase means that stopping distances do not just double, they quadruple. The reaction time required to identify a hazard and depress the brake pedal remains constant, roughly 1.5 seconds for an average driver, but the distance covered in that time balloons. At 100 miles per hour, a car travels 147 feet every second. Before the brain can even register a threat, the car has covered half a football field. Inside the Mustang, the systems were functioning perfectly. The engine was singing, the oil temperature was stable, the tires were warm. The machine was doing exactly what it was built to do. It was unaware of the context. It did not know the speed limit was 40 miles per hour. It did not know that Bayshore Boulevard was a recreational area frequented by families. It only knew the inputs provided by Cameron Herron. Throttle position 100%, gear selection aggressive. The two cars, the black Mustang and the gold Altima, roared northward, cutting through the humid air. They were 2 bullets fired from the same gun, traveling parallel paths. The synchronization of their movements suggested a singular purpose. They were locked in a dangerous dance, insulated by steel and glass, fueled by testosterone and gasoline. The mundane Wednesday morning had been fully supplanted by the high-stakes reality of the race. The build-up was complete. The variables of geography, mechanics, and human error had aligned. The speedometer continued to climb, the digital numbers flickering upward, marking the final seconds before the illusion of control would be shattered by the immutable laws of physics. The synchronization of their movements suggested a shared intent that went beyond mere commuting. As the black Mustang GT and the gold Nissan Altima surged northward, they occupied the roadway with a dominance that forced other drivers to recoil. The mechanics of the street race, a phenomenon often dismissed as juvenile recklessness, manifested here as a deadly physics equation. The two vehicles were not simply traveling fast, they were engaged in a contest of acceleration and positioning, treating the three-lane public boulevard as a private circuit. Witnesses located along the Bayshore Boulevard promenade later recounted the sensory overload of the event. The sound arrived before the vehicles did. It was a mechanical roar, a high-pitched crescendo of engines being pushed to their revolutions per minute limits. The Ford Mustang, equipped with a 5.0-liter V8 engine, emitted a distinct, guttural growl that reverberated off the seawall to the east and the residential facades to the west. Pedestrians utilizing the sidewalk, a popular recreational path for Tampa residents, described the noise as resembling a highway or a racetrack, an auditory anomaly for a road with a posted speed limit of 40 miles per hour. The sound was the first indicator that the safety of the afternoon was being dismantled. The interplay between Heron in the Mustang and Barano in the Nissan was aggressive. Witnesses observed the cars weaving through sparse traffic earlier in the route, cutting off other motorists to maintain their proximity to one another. As the traffic thinned near the intersection with Gandy Boulevard, the weaving ceased, replaced by raw linear speed. The two drivers were no longer jockeying for position amongst commuters. They were racing each other. The gold Nissan remained in the lane adjacent to the Mustang, struggling to match the horsepower of the American muscle car, but refusing to yield. The vehicles moved in tandem, a blur of metal cutting through the humid Florida air. Inside the Mustang, the driving environment was hermetically sealed from the consequences outside. The cabin was designed to dampen road noise, creating a disconnect between the driver's sensory inputs and the reality of the velocity. The speedometer, a digital gauge capable of displaying speeds far in excess of legal limits, climbed steadily. The data that would later be extracted from the vehicle's event data recorder, the automotive equivalent of a flight black box, captured the precise inputs of the machine during this sequence. It recorded a throttle percentage of 100%. The accelerator pedal was pressed flush against the floorboard. The fuel injectors were flooding the cylinders, and the transmission was holding gears to maximize torque. There was no modulation, no hesitation, and no attempt to cruise. The input was binary: maximum power. As the vehicles approached the intersection of West Knights Avenue, the geometry of the road remained straight, offering a deceptive sightline for pedestrians. Jessica Reisinger-Raubenolt stood at the edge of the boulevard. She was 24 years old, holding the handle of a stroller that seated her 21-month-old daughter Lilia. Jessica was familiar with the rules of the road, but her calculations that afternoon were based on a fundamental expectation of civil order. When a pedestrian assesses the safety of a crossing, they gauge the distance of oncoming cars and assume those cars are traveling at or near the speed limit. At 40 miles per hour, a car travels roughly 59 feet per second. A car 1,000 feet away offers ample time to cross. Jessica stepped off the curb. She moved across the southbound lanes without incident and reached the median, a grassy divider that serves as a refuge for pedestrians navigating the wide boulevard. From the median, she looked south again. The Mustang and the Nissan were visible, but they were distant. Based on the visual information available to her, the gap appeared sufficient. She committed to the crossing, stepping into the northbound lanes. She could not have known that the math was broken. The Mustang was not traveling at 59 feet per second. It was traveling at nearly 150 feet per second. The vehicle was closing the distance at 2.5 times the legal rate. This phenomenon, known as the loom effect, creates a dangerous optical illusion where an object traveling at extreme speed directly toward an observer does not appear to be moving laterally, making its velocity difficult to judge until it is terrifyingly close. The Mustang was not just approaching, it was devouring the asphalt between them. The event data recorder logged the peak speed at 102 miles per hour. At this velocity, the peripheral vision of a driver tunnels. The field of view narrows drastically, reducing the ability to detect hazards entering from the sides. Cameron Heron, enclosed in the cockpit of the Mustang, was piloting a missile. The gold Nissan was to his right, effectively boxing him into the left lane, closest to the median where Jessica was walking. The convergence of the three timelines, the mother, the child, and the driver, occurred in the span of 2 seconds. As Jessica moved further into the lane, the reality of the car's speed shattered the illusion of safety. The roar of the engine would have been deafening at this range. Witnesses described the horror of watching the scene unfold, a slow-motion realization of an inevitable impact. Jessica saw the black car bearing down on her. In that final fraction of a second, her instinct was not self-preservation, but protection. She did not freeze. She acted. She shoved the stroller forward, attempting to propel Lilia out of the direct path of the oncoming bumper. Simultaneously, the digital brain of the Mustang recorded a change in input. The throttle dropped from 100% to 0. The brake pedal was depressed. The reaction time of the driver was recorded, but the laws of physics remained absolute. A vehicle weighing nearly 4,000 pounds, traveling at over 100 miles per hour, possesses a kinetic energy that cannot be negated in an instant. The braking system engaged, the calipers clamping down on the rotors with maximum pressure. The anti-lock braking system pulsed rapidly, trying to maintain traction as the tires screamed against the hot pavement. The car began to decelerate, but the distance required to stop from triple-digit speeds is measured in football fields, not crosswalks. Heron attempted an evasive maneuver. He jerked the steering wheel, swerving the Mustang. However, in a tragic coincidence of reflex, he swerved in the same direction that Jessica was moving. The front passenger side of the Mustang collided with the mother and the stroller. The impact was violent and instantaneous. The massive transfer of energy occurred with a sickening thud that witnesses heard over the squeal of tires. The stroller, a construct of light aluminum and fabric, was disintegrated by the force of the collision. Lilia and Jessica were thrown through the air, their bodies subjected to forces that the human frame is not designed to withstand. They landed on the grassy shoulder of Bayshore Boulevard, far from the point of impact. The Mustang continued its forward momentum, carried by the residual velocity despite the locked brakes. It skidded, sliding across the pavement before finally coming to a halt. The front end of the vehicle was crumpled, the hood buckled upward, and the windshield shattered physical evidence of the violence inflicted. The gold Nissan, having witnessed the collision from the adjacent lane, braked hard and swerved, coming to a stop nearby. Silence rushed back in to fill the void left by the engines. The roaring exhaust notes were replaced by the settling of dust and the ticking of cooling metal. The race was over. The data recorder in the Mustang ceased its frenetic logging of acceleration and marked the final event, a collision. On the side of the road, bystanders who had been enjoying a leisurely afternoon sprinted toward the victims, their recreational walk transformed instantly into a scene of trauma triage. The discrepancy between the decision to race and the cost of that decision lay explicitly clear on the grass of Bayshore Boulevard. The speed had been thrilling for the driver for a matter of seconds. The impact was permanent. The immediate aftermath of the collision on Bayshore Boulevard was defined by a jarring dissonance between the scenic tranquility of the waterfront and the carnage occupying the asphalt. The silence that had briefly rushed in following the impact was shattered almost instantly, not by mechanical noise, but by human reaction. Witnesses who had been walking along the balustrade, enjoying the late spring morning, turned from casual observers into first responders. The sprawling linear park, usually a site of leisure, transformed into a zone of frantic triage. Bystanders rushed toward the point of impact, their attention divided between the crumpled black Ford Mustang and the two victims lying on the roadway. Calls to 911 began flooding the dispatch center in Tampa. The descriptions provided to operators were panicked and fragmented, painting a picture of high-speed chaos followed by sudden devastation. Callers reported a black sports car and a gold sedan, with several witnesses explicitly mentioning that the vehicles appeared to be racing prior to the crash. This information was relayed to approaching units from the Tampa Police Department, setting the tone for the investigation before officers even arrived on scene. The initial classification of the event shifted rapidly from a standard traffic accident to a potential crime scene involving vehicular homicide. Tampa Fire Rescue arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the heavy Florida air. paramedics immediately attended to Jessica Reisinger-Raubenold and her toddler, Lilia. The situation was dire. The force of the impact had been catastrophic, propelling both mother and child a significant distance from the crosswalk where they had been struck. Emergency personnel worked with desperate efficiency to stabilize them for transport to Tampa General Hospital. The urgency of the medical intervention temporarily paused the forensic preservation of the scene, a necessary trade-off in the attempt to save lives. As the ambulances sped away, the focus of the remaining law enforcement personnel shifted to the drivers and the physical evidence left behind. Cameron Herron, the 18-year-old driver of the Mustang, had exited his vehicle. He stood near the median, physically unharmed but visibly shaken. Standing with him was his brother Tristan, who had been the passenger in the Ford, and John Barrineau, the 17-year-old driver of the gold Nissan Altima that had stopped nearby. The three young men remained at the scene as police cruisers established a perimeter, cordoning off the northbound lanes of Bayshore Boulevard near the intersection with West Knights Avenue. The iconic roadway, often referred to as the longest continuous sidewalk in the world, was shut down, redirecting traffic and preserving the stretch of asphalt that now held the secrets of the collision. Officers separated the drivers to obtain individual statements, a standard procedure intended to prevent the collusion of narratives. When approached by law enforcement, the initial demeanor of the teenagers was one of shock mixed with defensiveness. Cameron Herron, wearing a dark t-shirt and shorts, appeared nervous. Police body camera footage and later testimony would characterize his behavior as quiet and anxious. He was observed pacing and making phone calls, notably reaching out to his mother almost immediately after the crash. When questioned about the events leading up to the collision, the initial accounts provided by the drivers downplayed the competitive nature of their driving. They did not immediately confess to an organized drag race. Instead, the narrative offered was one of driving simultaneously, perhaps changing lanes, but not engaging in a contest of speed. They acknowledged the presence of the pedestrians but claimed that the victims had stepped out unexpectedly, leaving Herron with insufficient time to react. This version of events, however, stood in stark contrast to the preliminary visual evidence and the mounting number of witness accounts being collected by patrol officers at the periphery of the scene. Crime scene technicians and traffic homicide investigators began the meticulous process of mapping the roadway. The geography of Bayshore Boulevard is unique. It is a long, straight expanse with few interruptions, a design that naturally tempts speed but also provides clear lines of sight. Investigators walked the path the Mustang had traveled, looking for the telltale signs of braking. Skid marks are the language of a crash scene, telling investigators when a driver perceived a threat and how they reacted. On this stretch of asphalt, the physical evidence was alarming. The tire marks found on the road were not the long, dragging streaks of a car that had been braking for a significant distance to avoid a hazard. Instead, they were short and intense, beginning only feet before the point of impact. This physical data suggested that there was almost no reaction time, or that the velocity of the vehicle was so great that the reaction occurred too late to alter the physics of the encounter. The lack of extensive pre-impact skid marks corroborated the witness statements, describing the Mustang as moving at an extreme velocity. It wasn't a case of a driver going 45 in a 40 zone and failing to stop. The evidence pointed to a vehicle covering ground so rapidly that the driver's perception, reaction time, was rendered useless. Debris was scattered across the northbound lanes. The stroller, which had been pushed by Jessica, was destroyed, its components flung across the road and onto the grassy shoulder. Personal effects, shattered plastic from the Mustang's front fascia, and glass from the windshield created a debris field that investigators had to photograph and tag. Each marker placed on the ground told a story of kinetic energy. The distance between the initial impact point marked by the scuffs on the road and the damage to the stroller and the final resting positions of the victims was measured with laser mapping tools. This throw distance is a critical calculation in accident reconstruction. Even without the internal computer data from the car, the distance the bodies were projected allowed investigators to mathematically determine that the striking vehicle was traveling well above the posted speed limit of 40 miles per hour. As the physical mapping continued, investigators turned their attention to the vehicles themselves. The 2018 Ford Mustang GT was a high-performance machine, and its condition reflected the violence of the collision. The front passenger side was heavily damaged, the hood buckled from the force of striking a human body. The windshield was caved in. In contrast, the gold Nissan Altima driven by Barano was untouched, sitting idly nearby. Its role in the crash was not one of contact, but of causation. Investigators examined the Nissan, noting its proximity to the Mustang. The positioning of the two cars supported the theory that they had been traveling in tandem, occupying adjacent lanes in a manner consistent with street racing. Witnesses who had been driving or walking along Bayshore began to provide detailed statements that filled in the gaps left by the silent physical evidence. One witness described the two cars speeding away from a traffic light further south, their engines revving loudly. Another motorist reported seeing the Mustang and the Nissan weaving through traffic, cutting off other drivers in a game of cat and mouse that spanned several blocks. These accounts were crucial. They moved the investigation from a case of simple negligence to one of conscious, reckless disregard for human life. The witnesses described the cars changing lanes aggressively to get around slower traffic, treating the public road as a private track. While the scene was being processed, officers evaluated Heron and Barano for signs of impairment. There was no immediate odor of alcohol or signs of drug use, suggesting that the crash was the result of sober, albeit reckless, decision-making. The absence of substances stripped away a potential defense or explanation. This was not a tragedy born of intoxication, but of ego and adrenaline. The boys were detained but not immediately arrested on the scene, as the formal charges would require the precise calculations of speed and the reconstruction of the accident to be finalized. However, their vehicles were seized. The police impounded both the Mustang and the Nissan, sealing them as evidence. This was a critical step, as the most damning witness was not a person, but the event data recorder, the black box, housed within the Mustang's electronic control module. As the sun climbed higher and the heat intensified, the initial chaos of the scene gave way to the slow, methodical work of the investigation. The police expanded their search for video evidence, canvassing nearby high-rise condominiums and businesses for surveillance footage that might have captured the race. The Bayshore area, lined with affluent residential buildings, was heavily monitored. Investigators knew that if the cars had been racing, cameras along the route would have captured their progression. The collection of this digital footprint began immediately, with officers requesting preservation of footage from the minutes leading up to the 911 calls. By the time the tow trucks arrived to remove the Mustang and the Nissan, the narrative of a tragic accident had been thoroughly dismantled by the evidence on the ground. The lack of braking, the throw distance of the victims, the witness testimony of racing, and the aggressive posturing of the vehicles prior to the crash all pointed toward a singular conclusion. The investigation at the scene concluded with the roadway being cleared and reopened, but the legal machinery had just begun to turn. The data collecting in the following hours, specifically the download of the Mustang's internal computer, would confirm what the skid marks and debris field had already whispered to the detectives. This was a collision born of extreme speed, where two young men turned a morning commute into a lethal competition. While the physical scene on Bayshore Boulevard was being cataloged by crime scene technicians, a quieter but far more damning investigation was beginning inside the impound lot where the 2018 Ford Mustang GT had been secured. The vehicle, a high-performance machine gifted to Cameron Heron for his graduation, was more than just twisted metal and shattered glass. It was a digital witness. Modern vehicles are equipped with a complex network of sensors and computers, primarily designed to manage engine performance and safety systems. Central to this network is the Restraints Control Module, RCM, often referred to colloquially as the black box or the Event Data Recorder, EDR. Investigators knew that while human memory is fallible and subject to self-preservation bias, the EDR would provide an objective, mathematical chronology of the final 5 seconds before the impact. Detectives and accident reconstruction experts accessed the Mustang's onboard diagnostic port, utilizing specialized Bosch crash data retrieval software to image the system. The data they extracted dismantled any potential defense regarding a mechanical failure or a momentary lapse in judgment. The report generated from the Mustang provided a granular, millisecond by millisecond account of Heron's inputs, painting a picture of deliberate, aggressive acceleration that criminalized his actions far beyond a simple traffic infraction. The digital forensic analysis focused on three critical data points: vehicle speed, throttle percentage, and braking status. The logs revealed that in the moments leading up to the collision, the Mustang was not merely coasting or traveling with the flow of traffic. The data showed a distinct and aggressive climb in velocity. At 5 seconds prior to the crash, the vehicle was already traveling well above the posted speed limit of 40 miles per hour. The graph of the speed did not show a steady cruise. It showed a sharp, upward trajectory, consistent with a drag race. The defining number that would dominate the courtroom and the public narrative was recorded approximately 2.5 seconds before impact. At that specific moment, the internal computer registered a speed of 102 miles per hour. This specific data point was catastrophic for Heron's defense. Bayshore Boulevard is a scenic, residential road often frequented by pedestrians, joggers, and families. Driving at 102 miles per hour, more than 2.5 times the legal limit, demonstrated a level of recklessness that elevated the charge. The EDR data effectively silenced any argument that Heron was merely speeding a little bit or had lost track of his velocity. To reach 102 miles per hour in that specific time frame and distance required intent. It required the driver to actively demand maximum performance from the engine. The throttle percentage data corroborated this intent. The EDR records the position of the accelerator pedal as a percentage of its total travel range. A driver navigating traffic or cruising typically modulates the throttle between 10 to 30%. The extracted logs from the Mustang showed the throttle position pinned at 100% for a sustained duration leading up to the critical moment. This wide-open throttle status is the mechanical signature of racing. It indicated that Heron had the pedal matted to the floor, deliberately extracting every ounce of horsepower the V8 engine could generate. There was no hesitation, no modulation, and no sign of caution until the very last second. The transition from acceleration to braking provided the third critical pillar of the digital evidence. The EDR records when the brake pedal is depressed and the switch in the circuit is activated. The data timeline showed that Heron reacted, but the reaction came far too late given the physics of the velocity he had generated. The logs indicated that he lifted his foot from the accelerator and applied the brakes less than half a second before impact. The time-to-collision calculations, derived from this data, proved that at 102 miles per hour, the vehicle was covering approximately 150 feet every second. This velocity creates a phenomenon known in accident reconstruction as the zone of unavoidable collision. At the legal speed limit of 40 miles per hour, a driver has a specific stopping distance composed of perception-reaction distance and braking distance. A standard perception-reaction time is often cited as 1.5 to 2 seconds. At 40 miles per hour, a driver travels about 59 feet per second. If a hazard appears, the driver travels nearly 90 feet before their foot even hits the brake, and then the car requires additional distance to skid to a halt. However, at 102 miles per hour, the math changes exponentially. The car was devouring distance so rapidly that by the time Jessica Reisinger-Raubenold entered Heron's field of vision, the laws of physics had already dictated the outcome. Investigators overlaid the digital data with the physical geography of Bayshore Boulevard to reconstruct the crash dynamics. The reconstruction showed that had Heron been traveling at the posted 40 miles per hour limit, the tragedy would have been entirely preventable. At 40 miles per hour, upon seeing the pedestrians entering the roadway, Heron would have had sufficient time to perceive the hazard, react, and bring the Mustang to a complete stop well short of the victims. Alternatively, at the lower speed, the pedestrians would have had enough time to cross the lane safely before the vehicle arrived at their location. The excessive speed robbed both parties of the time required to avoid the collision. It compressed the timeline of the event from a manageable traffic situation into an instantaneous catastrophe. The EDR data also contradicted the initial, often vague statements given at the scene. In the immediate aftermath of such crashes, drivers frequently underestimate their speed or claim the victims jumped out of nowhere. The digital footprint proved that the victims did not suddenly appear in a way that would have been unavoidable to a prudent driver. They were crossing a wide boulevard. The suddenness of the encounter was an illusion created by the Mustang's extreme velocity. The forensic analysis demonstrated that the victims were visible and present in the roadway for a duration that would have been actionable for a driver obeying the law. The only variable that made the crash inevitable was the speed of the Mustang. Furthermore, the digital investigation extended to the second vehicle, the Nissan driven by John Baranow. While the focus remained heavily on Heron as the striking vehicle, the EDR from Baranow's car provided necessary context. His data mirrored the aggressive acceleration profile found in the Mustang, confirming the synchronized movement of the two vehicles. This synchronization was the digital fingerprint of a street race. The two cars were not randomly speeding near each other. Their throttle inputs and speed curves showed a competitive interaction, vying for position and dominance on the roadway. This data solidified the state's case that the drivers were acting in concert, engaging in a conscious and intentional act of racing, which directly contributed to the fatality. The reconstructionists calculated the kinetic energy involved in the impact, which is a function of the square of the velocity. By hitting the victims at a speed significantly higher than highway speeds, the force transferred was massive. The EDR indicated that while Heron did apply the brakes right before impact, the speed reduction was negligible in terms of survivability. Scrubbing off 10 or 20 miles per hour when starting from 102 still leaves the vehicle traveling at a velocity that is almost universally fatal to pedestrians. The braking data showed the ABS, anti-lock braking system, engaging violently, but the tires simply could not overcome the momentum of the heavy muscle car in the remaining distance. This digital narrative laid bare the reality of the zero remorse aspect in terms of driving behavior. The sustained 100% throttle input spoke to a mindset of total disregard for the environment. The computer did not record a moment where the driver feathered the gas to check for cross traffic at intersections or slowed down for the visible pedestrian crossings. It recorded a singular, unwavering commitment to speed. The digital forensics stripped away the possibility of characterizing this as a mistake. A mistake is missing a stop sign or drifting a few miles over the limit. Pinning the accelerator of a 460 horsepower vehicle on a public road for a sustained period is a choice. The final report from the digital forensics team was a cold, hard document. It consisted of graphs, spreadsheets, and hexadecimal codes, but it told the story of the crash with more precision than any eyewitness. It detailed the exact millisecond the Mustang's sensors detected the inevitable, the moment the safety systems fired, and the rapid deceleration associated with the impact. It provided the prosecution with an unassailable timeline. There was no room for he said, she said regarding the speed. The car had confessed. In the quiet hum of the server room where the data was analyzed, the tragedy was reduced to physics and driver inputs. The 102 miles per hour figure became the anchor of the prosecution, a number that no amount of character testimony could erase. It quantified the negligence. It transformed the legal argument from a question of what happened to a question of how much responsibility must be taken. The inability to stop was not a function of the road conditions, the weather, or the visibility. It was a direct mathematical consequence of the input commanded by Cameron Heron's right foot. The extracted data ensured that the silence of the victims would be answered by the undeniable voice of the machine. For nearly 3 years, the legal machinery in Hillsborough County ground forward with agonizing slowness. The wreckage on Bayshore Boulevard had long been cleared. The flowers and teddy bears left at the roadside memorial had weathered and been replaced, yet the families of Jessica Reisinger, Raubenolt, and Lilia remained in a state of suspended animation. Justice, usually swift in cases with such clear evidence, was delayed by the procedural complexities of a double vehicular homicide investigation and then halted almost entirely by the global onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Courtrooms shuttered, hearings were conducted over video feeds, and the docket piled up. For the Raubenold family, this delay meant over 1,000 days of waiting for accountability, a prolonged period of grief without the punctuation mark of a verdict. By late 2020, as the courts began to navigate the backlog, a strategic fissure formed between the two defendants. John Baranow, the driver of the Nissan Altima, chose to separate his fate from Cameron Herron. While Baranow's vehicle had not physically struck the victims, Florida law regarding illegal street racing held him criminally liable as a principal participant in the event. His driving had facilitated the race, creating the conditions that led to the fatalities. Facing the same severe charges but recognizing that a jury might view his role differently than the driver of the striking vehicle, Baranow's legal team engaged in plea negotiations with the state. Baranow accepted a deal that would see him surrender his freedom but avoid the maximum penalty. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of vehicular homicide and a misdemeanor racing charge. In exchange, he accepted a sentence of 6 years in state prison, followed by 15 years of probation. His driver's license would be revoked, and he would be required to complete community service upon his release. It was a pragmatic decision, an admission that the evidence against him was insurmountable. Baranow was processed and sent away, removing one variable from the equation. Cameron Herron stood alone. The evidence against him was even more damning than that against Baranow. He was behind the wheel of the Mustang that delivered the fatal impact. The electronic data recorder had testified against him, locking in the speed at 102 miles per hour moments before the crash. The state prosecutor, Aaron Hubbard, signaled no intention of offering a lenient plea bargain. The public outcry demanded a sentence that reflected the loss of a young mother and her toddler. Facing a potential maximum of 30 years in prison if convicted by a jury, Herron and his attorney, John Fitzgibbons, made a high-stakes tactical maneuver in December 2020. They decided against a jury trial. The defense team understood that the emotional weight of the evidence, the stroller, the crime scene photos, the testimony of bystanders would be devastating before a jury of 12 citizens. Instead, Herron entered an open plea to the court. He admitted guilt to 2 counts of vehicular homicide, but with no agreement in place regarding his punishment. He threw himself on the mercy of the court, entrusting his future entirely to Circuit Judge Christopher Nash. The strategy was clear: convince the judge to depart from the standard sentencing guidelines. The defense aimed to secure youthful offender status for Herron, a designation in Florida law that can cap a prison sentence at 6 years or replace it with probation for defendants under 21. They banked on the idea that a judge, bound by legal rationality rather than emotional impulse, would weigh Herron's age and lack of criminal history more heavily than a jury might. The sentencing hearing arrived in April 2021, 3 years almost to the month since the crash. The proceedings spanned most of a week, transforming courtroom 51 into a battleground over the definition of justice. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with the collision of 2 families' tragedies. On one side sat the Herrons, holding on to the hope of rehabilitation. On the other, the Raubenolds, demanding retribution for an irreparable loss. The defense presented a comprehensive case for leniency, constructed around the biology of the adolescent brain. Attorney John Fitzgibbons called Dr. Michael Scott Marr, a forensic psychiatrist, to the stand. Dr. Marr's testimony was clinical and detailed. He explained to the court that the human brain, specifically the frontal lobe which governs executive function, impulse control, and risk assessment, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. At 18, he argued, Cameron Herron was chemically and structurally incapable of processing risk in the same way an adult would. The speeding was not an act of malice, but a predictable failure of an immature brain, overwhelmed by the dopamine rush of the race. To humanize the defendant, the defense paraded a series of character witnesses. Friends, former teachers, and family members took the stand to describe a polite, compassionate young man who had been an honor student and a constructive member of his community. They spoke of his deep remorse, describing a person who was haunted daily by the lives he had taken. They argued that sending him to prison for decades would serve no purpose other than to destroy a third life. Herron himself did not speak, but his demeanor in the courtroom, head bowed, often tearful, was offered as silent testimony to his regret. The prosecution dismantled this portrait of an innocent mistake. Aaron Hubbard focused on the element of choice. He argued that the crash was not a momentary lapse, like running a red light or missing a stop sign. The race on Bayshore Boulevard had covered a significant distance. The data showed multiple accelerations. There were opportunities to slow down, to disengage, to look at the speedometer, and realize the danger. Hubbard presented evidence that Herron had a history of speeding, having been warned previously about his driving habits. This was not a singular, out-of-character anomaly, the state argued, but the culmination of a pattern of reckless entitlement. Then came the victim impact statements, the most pivotal moments of the hearing. The abstraction of legal arguments regarding brain development evaporated when the family of the victims began to speak. David Raubanault, Jessica's husband and Lilia's father, took the podium. His presence commanded the room. He had lost his entire immediate family in a single violent instant. His testimony was a raw, searing indictment of the defendant's actions. He recounted the horror of the day, the phone call, the rush to the hospital, and the impossible reality of planning a funeral for his wife and baby daughter. He turned his gaze directly toward Cameron Herron. The courtroom went silent. Raubanault did not speak of accidents or mistakes. He spoke of accountability. He rejected the defense's narrative of a good kid who made a bad choice. "It is critical for you to understand that you've created everlasting pain and depths of sorrow," Raubanault told him. He described the terror Jessica must have felt in the final second of her life, seeing the Mustang bearing down on her, her final instinct to push the stroller in a futile attempt to save Lilia. Raubanault addressed the judge, imploring him to see through the defense's strategy. He argued that the sentence should reflect the value of the lives lost, not the potential of the life that took them. "This was a crash, not an accident," he stated. "Please be aware of that." The emotional gravity of his words hung over the proceedings, making the request for probation or a short stint in a youthful offender camp seem disproportionately light compared to the double grave the Raubanault family visited. Other family members spoke, echoing the sentiment that the punishment must fit the crime. They spoke of milestones that would never happen: Lilia's first day of school, Jessica's future career, the growing family they had planned. They painted a picture of a hole in the universe that could never be filled. When the testimony concluded, Judge Christopher Nash retired to deliberate. The open plea meant he had total discretion up to the statutory maximum. He could sentence Herron to probation, or he could sentence him to 30 years. The range of possibilities was terrifyingly vast. On the evening of the 8th of April 2021, everyone returned to the courtroom for the decision. Judge Nash began by reviewing the factors he had considered. He acknowledged the defense's presentation on brain development. He noted Herron's age at the time of the crash and his lack of a prior criminal record. He recognized the letters of support and the defendant's expression of remorse. However, the judge pivoted to the nature of the offense. He focused on the excessive speed, 102 miles per hour, in a zone shared with pedestrians, strollers, and joggers. He noted that Bayshore Boulevard is a known recreational area, not an empty highway. He cited the history of speeding warnings, indicating that Herron was aware of the risks associated with his vehicle. Crucially, Judge Nash addressed the request for youthful offender status. He stated that while the statute exists to help rehabilitate young people who make mistakes, the severity of this particular crime, resulting in 2 deaths, weighed heavily against it. The judge determined that the punishment had to reflect the magnitude of the loss. "I think it's important to look at the history of the defendant's driving," Nash said, methodically explaining his reasoning. He concluded that the aggravating factors overwhelmed the mitigating ones. The judge ordered Cameron Herron to stand. He pronounced the sentence, 9 years in Florida State Prison for the death of Jessica Reisinger Raubanault and 15 years for the death of Lilia Raubanault. The judge paused, then delivered the final, crushing detail. The sentences were to run consecutively. 24 years. The number sucked the air out of the room. Cameron Herron's eyes widened, his face draining of color as the reality struck him. He would not be going home. He would not be going to a youthful offender camp. He would be going to adult prison until he was 42 years old. Behind him, his family erupted in anguish. Cries of disbelief and sobbing broke the decorum of the court. The bailiffs moved in swiftly, instructing Herron to place his hands behind his back. The clinking of handcuffs marked the end of his life as a free man. Across the aisle, the Raubenold family sat quietly. There was no cheering, only the somber recognition that the legal fight was over. The judge had validated their loss. He had affirmed that the lives of a mother and child were worth more than a few years of inconvenience for the driver who killed them. As the deputies escorted Herron through the side door, leaving his weeping family behind, the open plea gamble was revealed as a catastrophic failure for the defense. The judge had sent a message that was heard far beyond Tampa. On the road, age is not an excuse for lethal recklessness. The delay was over. The sentence was passed. The case of State of Florida v. 100, Cameron Herron had reached its devastating legal conclusion. Judge Christopher Nash did not arrive at the figure of 24 years arbitrarily. In the silence that followed the removal of Cameron Herron from the courtroom, the legal reasoning behind the severity of the punishment began to ripple through the community and the press. The sentence exceeded the recommended guidelines, which had suggested a cap closer to 18 years, yet it fell short of the statutory maximum of 30 years sought by the prosecution. To justify this significant incarceration period, Judge Nash pointed directly to the digital evidence extracted from the Ford Mustang's internal computer system. The defense had spent days characterizing Herron as a terrified 18-year-old who made a singular, tragic mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment common to the adolescent brain. They argued that his youth should be a mitigating factor, suggesting that a long prison term would serve no rehabilitative purpose for a boy with no prior criminal record. However, Judge Nash dismantled this narrative by highlighting the pattern of behavior recorded by the vehicle itself. The event data recorder had not only captured the final, fatal acceleration on Bayshore Boulevard, but had also stored data from the days leading up to the crash. The judge noted that, specifically on May 19, just 4 days before killing Jessica Reisinger Raubenold and her daughter Lilia, the Mustang had been driven at speeds reaching 162 miles per hour. This was not a momentary lapse or a sudden burst of adrenaline. It was a habituated disregard for public safety. The evidence showed that Herron had treated the public roadways of Tampa as a private racetrack repeatedly. The incident on May 23 was the inevitable conclusion of a distinct pattern of recklessness. By citing this history, Judge Nash established that the 24-year sentence was a response to a sustained choice to endanger the community rather than a punishment for a single instant of distraction. As the courtroom emptied, the gravity of the sentence settled over the Tampa community. For David Raubenold, the widower and father left behind, the sentence brought a measure of accountability, though he expressed that no number of years could equate to the lives of his wife and child. He had stood before the court during the hearing, delivering a victim impact statement that left many in tears, describing the hallucination of seeing his daughter crawling through the house and the crushing silence of a home that was once full of life. The judicial system had done what it could, extracting nearly a quarter-century of liberty from the offender, but the restitution was purely symbolic. However, as the doors of the Florida State Prison System prepared to receive Cameron Herron, a bizarre and unprecedented phenomenon began to take shape in the digital realm. In the weeks following the sentencing, the narrative of the case was hijacked by a sprawling, chaotic movement on social media platforms, particularly TikTok and Twitter. Instead of focusing on the tragic loss of a young mother and a 21-month-old baby, millions of users began to fixate on the physical appearance of the convict. Clips of Herron hearing his sentence specifically, the moment his eyes widened in shock before he looked toward the ceiling, went viral, accumulating billions of views. These short videos were often set to melancholic or romantic music, utilizing slow-motion editing techniques typically reserved for celebrities or fictional heartthrobs. A disturbing fan base emerged, rallying under the hashtag Justice for Cameron. The commentary attached to these videos revealed a profound disconnect from the reality of the crime. Users, many of whom appeared to be teenagers themselves, commented that he was too cute for prison or that he deserved a second chance, solely based on his looks. This digital crusade rapidly expanded beyond typical true crime fascination. It morphed into a global campaign, with analytics revealing that a significant portion of the traffic originated from outside the United States, including countries in the Middle East and South America. Cybersecurity experts later analyzed the traffic and suggested that while genuine fan accounts existed, there was likely a component of bot activity amplifying the hashtags, though the motivation for such a bot campaign remained obscure. Change.org petitions demanded a reduction in his sentence, garnering tens of thousands of signatures from individuals who had likely never heard of Bayshore Boulevard or the Raubenolt family prior to seeing a 10-second video clip on their phone screens. The online discourse became a theater of the absurd. Supporters compared Heron to fictional characters, creating fan art and writing fan fiction that reimagined him as a misunderstood victim of a harsh system. They scrutinized the judge's decision, not based on legal statutes or the evidence of excessive speed, but on emotional appeals regarding Heron's wasted youth. They argued that 24 years was a life sentence for an 18-year-old, conveniently ignoring the permanent sentence imposed on Jessica and Lilia. The phenomenon highlighted a jarring lack of empathy for the actual victims, burying the images of the stroller and the crushed Mustang under an avalanche of fan cams dedicated to the driver. For the Raubenolt family, this digital afterlife of the case added a layer of surreal cruelty to their grief. The man who had killed their loved ones was being celebrated as a tragic romantic figure by strangers worldwide. The internet had flattened the complex, horrific reality of vehicular homicide into an aesthetic, stripping away the blood and the wreckage to leave only the face of a young man in a suit. It was a testament to the warping power of social media, where consequence is often divorced from cause, and visual appeal can override moral judgment. Ultimately, the viral storm did not alter the legal reality. The Florida judicial system remained impervious to the trends of TikTok. Cameron Heron was processed into the Department of Corrections to begin serving his time. The hashtags eventually slowed, and the algorithm moved on to the next viral sensation, leaving the substantive facts of the case unchanged. The physical legacy of the crash on Bayshore Boulevard proved more enduring than the online hysteria. The city of Tampa implemented changes to the scenic road, lowering speed limits and installing new pedestrian crossings and traffic signals in an attempt to curb the culture of speeding that had long plagued the stretch. The strip of pavement where the race ended became a somber landmark, a reminder of the fragility of pedestrians in the face of high-performance engineering. In the end, the 24-year sentence served as a grim benchmark for vehicular homicide cases in Florida. It sent an unequivocal message that the weaponization of a vehicle would be treated with the same severity as other lethal crimes. The youth of the perpetrator was not a shield against the consequences of catastrophic negligence. For the community, the tragedy faded into a cautionary tale told to young drivers. But for the families involved, the timeline had bifurcated permanently on that May morning. Cameron Heron remained in a cell, his 20s and 30s forfeited to the state, watching the world evolve from a distance. Meanwhile, the Raubenolt family continued to navigate a world with a void that no judicial sentence, however lengthy, could ever fill. The final verdict was not the years on a prison ledger, but the silence where two voices used to be.